There was a time when sport still retained the power to surprise us, not merely with outcome, but with form. A past that seemed impossible until it arrived. A movement too quick to name and too graceful to reduce. A goal, a feint, a leap, a turn, a recovery. Not just effective, but beautiful. One watched in part to see who would win, of course, as only a philosopher or a lunatic pretends otherwise. But one also watched because sport, at its best, offered something more than competition. It offered style under pressure, form in motion, human excellence made visible. And now, increasingly, it offers PowerPoint. This is the age of analytics, optimization, expected goals, shot maps, efficiency ratings, load management, marginal gains, and all the other bloodless instruments by which the modern world attempts to improve everything by measuring it to death. Now, let us be fair at the outset. Analytics are not worthless. Numbers can reveal tendencies the eye misses. They can expose superstition, puncture vanity, and correct stupidity, a service much needed in every age. If a manager believes in some old tactical absurdity because his grandfather did, the spreadsheet may perform a public good. The problem begins when the measurable starts colonizing the meaningful. And that, I think, is exactly what David Best would help us see. Best spent a great deal of time thinking about the aesthetic dimension of sport. He was interested in the fact that sport is not just about outcomes, but about qualities of movement, style, grace, timing, rhythm, and the experience of seeing or performing something excellent. He also drew distinctions between sports that are judged by achieving a purpose, scoring, crossing the line, winning the point, and sports whose result is more directly tied to aesthetic judgment. What matters for us is that he took seriously the proposition that sport is not only efficient action, it is also a field of aesthetic value. That is the missing truth in the analytics age. Because analytics, by their nature, privilege what can be counted. They are superb at answering questions like how often, how far, how efficiently, how probable, how repeatable. All useful questions. But there are other questions, and they are often the ones that make sport worth loving. How beautifully, how daringly, how unexpectedly, how humanly, at what cost, under what pressure, with what touch of style, nerve, and imagination. These questions do not disappear merely because they are harder to enter into a dashboard. And yet modern sporting culture increasingly behaves as if they do. Take football, or basketball, or baseball, or any sufficiently professionalized modern sport. What begins as analysis easily becomes doctrine. Coaches, owners, recruitment departments, broadcasters, and eventually fans begin to speak as though the only real intelligence is numerical intelligence. A player is no longer first a presence, a temperament, a style, a way of moving through the game. He becomes an output profile, a cluster of efficiencies, a set of percentages with a pulse. This is not understanding. It is abstraction with a budget. And abstraction, though useful, has a nasty tendency to become tyrannical once it forgets that it is only a tool. Bess, I suspect, would say that sport ceases to be fully itself when it is reduced to successful problem solving. For if sport were only that, then the most beautiful victory and the ugliest one would be equal so long as the scoreline matched. A grim, joyless contest of pure utility would be as rich as a display of daring intelligence and expressive excellence. But this is plainly false. Everyone who has really watched sport knows it is false. There is a difference between winning and playing magnificently, a difference between efficiency and elegance, a difference between the merely effective and the memorable. And the most frightening thing about the analytics regime is not that it notices efficiency. It is that it teaches people to become embarrassed by caring about anything else. One can already hear the dreary retort, but winning is the point. Yes, and breathing is the point of lungs. It does not follow that opera is reducible to respiratory function. The purpose of sport includes winning, obviously, but sport becomes culturally and spiritually significant because of the ways in which that purpose is pursued and displayed. If all that mattered were the cold extraction of result, we would all watch simulations and declare the matter settled. But we do not. We watch human beings because form matters, gesture matters, decision matters, nerve matters. The look of excellence matters. This is where analytics becomes dangerous, not when it informs judgment, but when it replaces it. A coach who uses data as one aid among many is sensible. A culture that begins to believe beauty is merely inefficiency waiting to be corrected is barbaric. And that is not too strong a word. For barbarism does not always arrive with axes. Sometimes it arrives with consultants. It arrives in neat graphics and managerial language. It assures you that nothing valuable is being lost. Only sentimentality, only romance, only the primitive attachment to style over substance. But style is not the opposite of substance in sport. Very often, it is substance in visible form. A feint, a tempo change, a piece of spatial imagination, a line-breaking pass, a perfectly timed take-on, a movement of deceptive grace. These are not decorative extras. They are manifestations of human excellence that happen to exceed the accountant's preferred vocabulary. Best helps us hold that line. He reminds us, in effect, that sport is not just a machine for producing winners. It is one of the last modern stages on which embodied excellence appears before the public in a form that is immediate, intelligible, and moving. It educates the eye. It refines perception. It teaches us to notice balance, courage, rhythm, economy, creativity, control. Remove or degrade those dimensions, and one does not merely alter tactics. One impoverishes the thing itself. This is why so many people feel, without always having the language for it, that something has gone missing from modern sport. The games are faster, the athletes fitter, the systems more optimized, the margins more professionalized. And yet, in many cases, the spectacle feels thinner, less alive, less idiosyncratic, more systematized, more managerial, as if the game were slowly being designed by people who understand probability, but not glory. That is the psychic cost of analytics absolutism. It produces a world in which risk is suspect, anomaly is corrected, and style is tolerated only if it can justify itself in immediate output. The player with a strange rhythm, a flamboyant instinct, an eccentric grace, a taste for the improbable, once the soul of sport, is increasingly disciplined into better decision-making, which often means decisions more legible to the model. And one cannot help wondering whether this is progress or merely standardization under the banner of intelligence. Because there is another kind of intelligence at work in sport. Not the intelligence of data, but of perception. Not the intelligence of the model, but of the body. The intelligence that sees a space before it exists, that senses a rhythm in the game, that knows when to pause, when to improvise, when to violate expectation. You may measure its effects after the fact, but you do not generate it by measurement. This matters beyond sport. For the analytics age is part of a larger modern fantasy, that whatever cannot be quantified is either unreal or expendable, that if beauty, style, courage, atmosphere, presence, and expressive excellence resist clean numerical capture, they must be subordinate to what can be graphed. This is the philosophy of bureaucrats, not of civilized people. Civilized people know that some of the highest things are visible, undeniable, and yet not reducible. Love is like that. Humor is like that. Greatness in art is like that. And greatness in sport is like that too. The task, then, is not to become Luddites in shin pads. It is not to banish numbers and return to superstition. It is to subordinate analysis to judgment, not judgment to analysis. Use the numbers. Certainly, but do not let them educate the eye into blindness. Because once a culture learns to sneer at beauty for not being efficient enough, it has already begun to lose its soul. And sport, if it is worth anything at all, is one of the places where the soul ought still to be visible. Not merely in victory, but in the manner of it. Not merely in output, but in form. Not merely in what works, but in what is worth admiring. That is what David Best would help us remember. And in an age increasingly determined to count everything, remembering what cannot be counted may be the last defense of beauty we have.